Welcome, boys and girls, to Story Time. Today, we continue our story, Our Dangerous Journey. If you remember last week, Christian and Hopeful had a visit to Doubting Castle. Not a place I want to go. Remember the big giant ogre, and Hopeful and Christian were beaten and not fed, and they were weak and they were weary. But then they were encouraged with scripture and promises that he had, and the promise there was a key. And the key opened the door, and they were able to flee and get away from that giant ogre. Well, this week, Christian continues his journey to the Celestial City in chapter 8, The Dark River. Let's read. Christian and his new friend Hopeful had now reached the Delectable Mountains, which Christian had seen from the Palace Beautiful. And what a pleasant change was here! After the squalor of the giant's prison, they were able to wash themselves in clear streams and to eat freely the fruit of the orchards. Do you see them there? Hopeful is eating an apple, and Christian is bathing in that wonderful stream. Look at all these people. Next, they were met by a party of shepherds feeding their flocks, who led them most lovingly to a topmost peak. From here, they said, is your first glimpse of the Celestial City, if you have skill to look through our perspective glass. So they looked through the perspective glass to see the Celestial City. They looked and thought they saw what might have been a golden gate. I saw also in my dream that as they stood leaning on their staffs, the way that weary pilgrims do, the shepherds gave them these two warnings. One, beware of the flatterer. What is a flatterer? It's somebody who tells you all these wonderful, nice things about you, but their motives aren't always very good. And two, take heed of the enchanted ground. With that, they sent them on their way. Two warnings: beware of the flatterer and take heed of the enchanted ground. Here we go. Now, from a crooked lane ahead of them appeared a brisk young lad. His name was Ignorance. He'd set out that morning from the country of Conceit to walk to the Celestial City. Christian proceeded to question him. But you didn't come in by the wicket gate. You came in by this crooked lane. I couldn't be expected to go all the way back, said Ignorance. Then what have you to show at the gate of heaven? Christian asked. Have you your parchment? Oh, no, I shan't need that, said Ignorance. But they may take you for a thief or a robber, warned Christian. Gentlemen, you are utter strangers to me, said Ignorance. Be content to practice your religion, and I will practice mine. I'm sure all will be well. He clearly wouldn't listen to advice, so they left the lad to follow on behind. Arriving at a place where two ways met, they were wondering which way to go, when behold, a man dressed in white came up to them. They supposed he was one of the Shining Ones. Hearing that they were bound for Heaven's Gate, he said to them most civilly, I'm going there myself, so follow me. But the road kept bending round and round, till presently they found themselves with the city quite behind them. This can't be right, they said, and they tried to stop, but all too late, for they had got entangled in a net they hadn't seen, which was drawn across their path. The more they tried to free themselves, the more enmeshed did they become. As to the man in the white, he'd thrown off his robe and was revealed for what he was, a villainous being who mockingly abandoned them. They might have languished there all day had not a real Shining One appeared and cut the net and set them free. Did no one warn you against the flatterer? The angel asked. The shepherds did, said Christian. But we never thought that his fine-spoken man was he. They were back at their right road again, with ignorance still following behind, when yet another traveler was seen coming to meet them. His name was Atheist. And when he heard where they were going, he broke out in loud laughter. Ha 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 ha! I laugh to see what ignorant persons you are, explained Atheist, to take so tedious a journey and then have nothing to show at the end of it. Why, sir, do you think we shan't be received? The Atheist repeated. There's no such place. I've been looking for this city for 20 years. Heaven does not exist. So saying, he swept past them on his way, but they knew better, having lately seen the city through the shepherd's telescope. He tried to trick them, didn't he? He said there was no celestial city. And I saw them in my dream that, as they were passing through a certain vale, a gradual weariness assailed their limbs. The air was heavy, as before a storm, and they grew very drowsy. I can hardly keep my eyes open, said Hopeful to his fellow. Let's stop and take a nap, for sleep is sweet to the laboring man, and we may wake refreshed. Equally, said Christian, we may never wake again, for this, methinks, is the enchanted ground, of which the shepherds warned us. Poor Hopeful looked aghast at being so unwise. Hopeful was almost tricked. Had I been here alone, he said, I must have met my death. For now, indeed, it felt as if someone had cast a spell on them. But they were not to be ensnared a second time. We'll keep ourselves awake by good discourse, said Christian, stifling his yawn. And talking all the while, they forced their feet along and so made their escape. They entered now a country where the air was sweet again. The flowers grew, the birds all sang, and the sun shone night and day. For this was the land of Beulah, where the Shining Ones commonly walked, and it lay upon the frontier of heaven. Behind them they could just see, looking back, a shadow in the sky, which marked the place where Doubting Castle stood. But ahead there was a perfect view of the celestial city, a city founded higher than the clouds. Its walls and towers shone in the sun, so dazzling that pilgrims had to look at it through clouded glass until their eyes grew more accustomed to the light. Then, just as they imagined they were safely there, they all at once stood still, quite stunned by what they saw, for between them and the city gate flowed a deep, dark river, over which a mist forever swirled. They looked to the left and they looked to the right, but the men on the bank said, "You have to go through it. There is no bridge." Do you see the celestial city? And here is that dark, deep, misty river. And there they are, Hopeful and Christian. It was a fearful moment, for Christian couldn't swim. Yet after coming all that way, he mustn't falter now. He stepped into the river trembling and immediately began to sink. He shouted to his good friend, "Hopeful! Hopeful! The waves are swallowing me up!" Hopeful tried to keep his head above water, but the river was so deep that Christian sank again. He was more frightened now than he had ever been, even in the valley of the shadow. A great darkness and horror fell upon him, for this was the river of death, and he feared he was drowning in it. But the troubles a man goes through in these waters are no sign that God has forsaken him. All at once the sun was visible through the mist. The pilgrims felt new strength within themselves. The water became less deep. The ground was firmer underfoot, and so they reached the shore. Look where they are. Meanwhile, what of Ignorance, who was never far behind? He got over without half the difficulty of the others, and didn't even wet his shoes, for he had met a dubious ferryman called Vain Hope, who ferried him across. Upon the farther bank, 2 men in shining clothes were standing to receive our friends. It's you they wait for," said Christian to Hopeful. "You have been hopeful ever since I knew you, and so have you," said he to Christian. "Now you must know that the city stood upon a mighty hill, but the pilgrims went up that hill with agility and speed. They had such glorious companions to take them by the arm. But no one was there to welcome Ignorance, for he had to climb the path alone. Then, as the pilgrims neared the gate, the whole of the heavenly host must have known of their arrival, for they were greeted by the king's own trumpeters, who made all of heaven echo with their sound. Doo-doo-doo-doo! Doo-doo-doo-doo! But when Ignorance knocked to be admitted, the men above the gate looked down on him and said, "Where is your parchment roll, my friend, to prove that you have come by the right road?" He fumbled in his coat, but having nothing, as we know, he stood silent underneath their gaze, then sorrowfully turned back. That was the last we ever saw of Ignorance. The pilgrims, on the other hand, both had their parchments ready, and a voice cried out, "These pilgrims now are come from the city of destruction, for the love they bear to the king of this place." So the gates of heaven opened to them, and they entered in. "And," writes Bunyan in his book, "I was able to look in after them. I saw the streets were paved with gold, and in them walked, with crowns upon their heads, the company of just men made perfect, and the bells of the city rang for joy, for Christian and his fellow had come to their true home. And after that they shut the gates, and I awoke, and behold, it was a dream." Bunyan, the author, John Bunyan, tells of his dream about Christian and his journey to the celestial city. And so that leaves us with the last chapter, which we will read, chapter 9, next week. Christiana, Christian's wife. We get to learn of her story. Until next time, boys and girls.